What if I told you that, like, one of the most widely read, heavily scrutinized religious texts in human history isn't, well, it actually isn't a book about religion at all.
I mean, that's a wild claim right out of the gate.
Right. But welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're looking at this really radical framework that claims we have fundamentally mistranslated basically a master plan for a global economic system.
Yeah, turning it into, like, a book of mystical magic spells instead of a structural blueprint.
Exactly. And I want you, the listener, to just imagine something with me for a second. Picture yourself holding a highly advanced, incredibly complex architectural blueprint.
Okay, like a real detailed schematic.
Yeah, not just a rough sketch on a napkin. I mean, a comprehensive, rigorously detailed master plan for building this thriving, equitable, structurally sound city.
Right, so it has the schematics for the plumbing, the power grid.
The social infrastructure, the exact load-bearing calculations for the bridges, like everything is there to build a utopia.
So you have the instructions for a perfect city.
You do, but instead of taking that blueprint to a construction site, rolling it out on a table and actually getting to work building the city, you take it to a custom framer.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah, you put it behind expensive anti-glare museum glass. You hang it on the wall in your living room. And like every morning, you just stand in front of it and recite the text written in the margins.
You're just reading the pipe measurements out loud.
Exactly. You don't build the plumbing, you just chant the measurements, hoping that the mere act of reading the schematic out loud will just magically bring your household good luck.
I mean, it sounds like a diagnosis for a collective delusion, honestly.
Totally.
If you saw a city planner doing that while their actual city was crumbling outside their window, you'd assume they had completely lost their grip on reality.
Right, because a blueprint is an abstract art.
Exactly. It doesn't exist to be venerated, It exists to be executed. And yet, this specific absurd scenario is basically the central thesis of the source material we are unpacking today.
Yeah, it's pretty mind-blowing. We are looking at a fascinating set of translated lecture notes and this philosophical synthesis from the rationalist school of Allama G.A. Parwez.
And his main argument is that this framing the blueprint phenomenon is exactly what has happened to the Quran.
Right, and the text refers to this as falling into the ritual trap.
The ritual trap, yeah.
So that is our mission for this deep dive. We have this stack of incredibly dense, thought-provoking notes detailing Parwez's synthesis of Quranic socioeconomics.
Specifically focusing on a section known as Surah Al-Imran.
Yes, exactly. And our goal today is to completely shatter that naive misconception. The idea that these verses are merely a collection of mystical incantations meant for ritualistic blessing.
Or just like isolated individual salvation.
Right. We are going to unpack how this rationalist framework reads the text as a rigorous, actionable civilizational blueprint.
Which means we have to prepare ourselves to fundamentally challenge how we organize human society.
Right.
Like from the ground up.
Totally. But before we dive into the mechanics of this, I think it's important to set some ground rules for you, the listener.
Yeah, definitely a good idea.
Because as we navigate these sources, you are going to encounter some incredibly sharp systemic critiques of our modern world.
Oh, yeah. The text heavily critiques capitalistic monopolies, the hoarding of wealth, and, traditional religious hierarchies.
Right. And our objective here isn't to endorse a specific political platform, left or right. We are simply acting as your guides to impartially convey these profound, often radical ideas contained in this specific rationalist interpretation.
We just want to show you the architecture of this philosophy. We're not taking sides.
Exactly. So, okay, let's unpack this. Because to read any blueprint, you first have to understand its legend.
Right. The key that tells you what the symbols mean.
Yeah. I mean, if you look at a schematic and think a solid black line means like a decorative stripe, when it actually represents a load-bearing steel beam.
Your building is going to collapse the second you put weight on it.
Exactly. And our source material makes this massive ground-up claim. It demands a total retranslation of vocabulary that people have literally been using for centuries.
It argues that over time, the language has basically been hijacked.
Yeah. Words that originally had concrete, systemic, socioeconomic definitions were slowly softened into these private, mystical, sort of religious definitions.
And that linguistic shift is really the key to unlocking the entire text. I mean, the most glaring example in the source glossary is the distinction between two fundamental concepts, mazhab and deen.
Okay, let's get into that, because traditionally mazhab is the word translated as religion, right?
All right. And think about how the modern world defines religion. It is almost universally viewed as a highly private, individualistic relationship between a person and God.
The focus is entirely inward.
Exactly. It's about personal salvation, the rituals you perform in the quiet of your room, and basically securing your own individual ticket to a peaceful afterlife.
It's highly compartmentalized. I mean, you go to work, you participate in a ruthless capitalist economy Monday through Friday, and then on the weekend, you go to your designated building for a few hours to practice your mazhab.
That's a great way to put it.
It's kind of like a personal fitness tracker, right? It's on your wrist, it counts your moral steps, it monitors your personal spiritual heart rate.
And if you hit your goal, you get a little digital badge.
Yeah, but it's entirely about you.
That analogy captures the isolation perfectly. But Parwez's rationalist methodology argues that the text we're studying does not present a mazhab at all.
It presents a deen.
Right. And the glossary defines deen not as a private faith, but as a comprehensive, collective socioeconomic and sociopolitical order.
It is a material system.
Exactly. In this framework, individual piety literally cannot be achieved in a vacuum. Like, you cannot be good on an island.
Because there's no one there to interact with systemically.
Right. True integration requires you to plug into a collective social structure and actively enforce a system of equitable laws in the real material world.
Okay, sticking with the health metaphor for a second. If mazhab is the personal fitness tracker, then deen is an entire public health infrastructure.
Oh, I like that.
Right. It's the sanitation department, the hospitals, the clean water regulations, the epidemiological response teams.
Because a global public health crisis, like a pandemic or systemic poverty, cannot be solved by everyone just staying home and looking at their own fitness trackers.
Exactly. You need coordinated, systemic action.
And this demands a redefinition of the actions within that system. The source material highlights two practices specifically, salat and sabar.
Which usually mean prayer and patience, right?
In the fitness tracker mindset of a private religion, salat is just the physical ritual of prayer, and sabar is translated as passive patience, just quietly enduring hardship until you die.
But in the systemic blueprint of deen, these take on structural meanings.
Right. Salat is defined here as the active adherence to the divine roadmap, literally organizing the society's schedule and laws around these universal values.
And sabar isn't passively suffering.
No, it is systemic steadfastness. It is the grit required to hold the line when the economic or political system is under immense pressure.
Wow, that reframing changes the entire psychological posture of the individual. I mean, if sabar isn't just waiting for things to get better, but actually means holding your ground in a shield wall,
It changes everything.
it really begs a massive question. If personal piety, just being a quiet, nice person who prays in their room isn't enough, what does actual measurable goodness look like in this public health infrastructure?
Well, the sources address that by introducing another redefinition. The concept of neki, which usually translates to piety or good deeds.
Right, being a good person.
But the traditional religious mindset defines piety through incredibly safe, insulated acts. The text uses evocative examples to illustrate this.
Like what?
Like sweeping the floors of the sanctuaries, laying down the prayer carpets, passively handing out water to pilgrims. It's a very aesthetic goodness.
It's safe. It doesn't challenge anyone's power.
Exactly. But the rationalist framework shatters that comfort zone. It argues that true piety is kinetic. It is the active, physical defense of human values.
So it's not staying in the sanctuary.
No, it is the courage to step out of the sanctuary and into the messy, dangerous battlefield of life to confront exploitative forces head-on.
Which introduces us to two very distinct categories of people mentioned in the notes, the qaidin and the mujahideen.
Right. So the qaidin literally translates to those who sit back.
Okay.
Think about how traditional theology often reveres the passive ascetic, the monk, the hermit, or the mystic who retreats from the corrupt, noisy world to sit isolated on a mountain or in a cloister.
Yeah. They're often viewed as like the absolute pinnacle of spiritual purity because they have washed their hands of material messiness.
But this rationalist reading unequivocally declares the qaidin as structurally inferior. A society, a collective human enterprise, cannot survive on passive thoughts and prayers.
Because a blueprint doesn't build a load-bearing bridge just because you whisper nice things to it.
Precisely. The system requires the second group, the mujahideen. Now, obviously, we have to completely strip away the modern geopolitical and media baggage of that word.
Right, totally.
And look at how this specific text defines it. Here, they are the active strivers. Let's call them the systemic enforcers.
Okay, I like that term.
They are the ones who actively risk their personal resources, their physical comfort, their wealth, and even their biological lives for systemic reform.
So they're the ones actually dismantling monopolies and establishing socioeconomic equity.
Exactly. Their piety is highly functional and outcome-oriented.
Now, here's where it gets really interesting for me, because this redefinition of what makes a person good completely alters how the text defines being alive.
Oh yes, the Hayat and Amwat distinction.
Yeah, this was the section of the source material that made me, put my notes down and just stare out the window for a minute. The distinction between Hayat, meaning life, and Amwat, meaning death.
It is a profound philosophical pivot, because from a purely biological standpoint, we define life as respiration.
Right. You have a pulse, your lungs take in oxygen, your brain shows electrical activity boom. You are classified as alive.
And death is just the cessation of that pulse. But Parwez's synthesis argues that this physical life, which the text calls biological respiration, is functionally indistinguishable from the existence of a basic animal.
How so?
Well, think about the biological imperative. Eating, sleeping, seeking shelter, reproducing, and above all else, prioritizing your own self-preservation. Every animal on Earth operates on this exact software.
The notes actually mention a bird building a nest. It flies back and forth all day with twigs. It works incredibly hard. It feeds its young. It's entirely driven by a biological program.
It's not making a moral choice, it's just surviving.
Right. And if we apply that to humans, I mean, you can have someone who wakes up at 5 a.m., puts on a suit, goes to a corporate job, aggressively outmaneuvers their coworkers to get a massive bonus.
Buys a bigger house, secures their offspring's future.
Yeah. From society's perspective, they are absolutely crushing it. But from the perspective of this blueprint, they are essentially just a bird with a very expensive, complicated twig.
That is a brilliant way to frame it. That is biological life. But the text argues that true human life, evolutionary human life, only emerges when an individual develops the capacity to recognize and uphold permanent values.
The text calls this mustaqila qadar, right?
Yes, mustaqila qadar. This means the ability to distinguish objective right from wrong and, crucially, choosing the right thing, even when it directly threatens your biological survival or material comfort.
Okay, let me make sure I'm fully grasping the weight of this. The text is saying that if you are a human being walking around, breathing, accumulating millions in your bank account,
Right.
but the moment a moral crisis occurs, say you witness massive systemic exploitation, or you are asked to stand up against a corrupt institution, you choose to stay quiet to protect your paycheck and your physical safety.
Then, according to this framework, you are structurally, definitionally dead.
Wow. You are Amwat. You are just a walking corpse acting out animal instincts.
That is the uncompromising stance of the framework. A person who abandons universal values to protect their material gain is a biological automaton. They have no true self.
That is intense.
Conversely, if an individual sacrifices their physical comfort, their wealth, or even their biological life to defend a higher truth or protect the vulnerable, they transcend biology.
They achieve what the text calls the kuti, the evolutionary immortality of the human self.
Exactly. Therefore, they are eternally alive, regardless of whether their physical heart is still beating.
I mean, it fundamentally rewires the dashboard we use to measure a successful society.
It really does.
The source notes explicitly state that a societal order must evaluate its vitality not by its GDP, not by the height of its skyscrapers or, the luxury of its citizens,
But by their active, collective commitment to these permanent values.
So, if we have a society where everyone is incredibly wealthy, the streets are clean, and the technology is advanced, but not a single citizen is willing to risk $1 or a drop of sweat to stop an injustice happening in the margins.
That society is a graveyard.
It's a glittering high-tech necropolis.
It's a chilling diagnosis of much of the modern world, and it leads us naturally into the next massive phase of this blueprint.
Because we've established the legend, we know the vocabulary now.
Right. We know that we are dealing with a public systemic order, that piety is kinetic action,
Yeah.
and that true life requires prioritizing values over biology.
But, philosophy doesn't feed people.
Exactly. How does this system actually function on a material, logistical level? How does this society organize its economy to sustain this elevated version of human life?
Right, because you can't just ask an entire population to subordinate their primal animal instincts of self-preservation without providing a massive safety net.
You just have chaos.
Yeah, you need a robust, foolproof economic engine to make that social contract work. And the text calls this engine the Universal Sustenance Engine, or Nizam-e-Rububiyat.
And true to form, it requires us to rethink a couple more terms. Rizq and fetal.
Okay, let's strip away the mystical baggage again. Conventionally, rizq is viewed as a magical provision, right?
Yeah, either material wealth granted to you in this world by divine favor, or physical sustenance waiting for you in a literal heaven after you die.
And fatal is usually interpreted as, like, a divine bonus, like unexpectedly getting a promotion or winning the lottery.
But in this rationalist view, these terms are deeply pragmatic. They denote the evolutionary, psychological, and systemic growth of the human personality and the society.
The Arabic term used is nashanuma, right?
Yes, which implies continuous structural nourishment.
So it's not a magical check arriving in the mail because you prayed hard enough. It's systemic nourishment. It's the guarantee that the environment you live in is engineered to cultivate your potential.
Yes. The argument is that when individuals align their material actions with these universal laws, the socioeconomic system they build naturally guarantees their progressive development.
Okay.
But let's look at the actual mechanics of the social contract the text proposes, because it introduces the concept of the markaz, or the central authority.
Right, the markaz.
The citizens in this system are expected to surrender their excess wealth, their resources, and even their physical lives to the mobilization calls of this central authority.
Okay, we need to put the brakes on here and have a serious debate about this, because I am channeling the listener right now, and red flags are going up everywhere.
I completely understand why.
If an individual is being told to surrender their bank account, their property, and their bodily autonomy to a central state apparatus, I mean, I've read 1984. I know my 20th century history.
It sounds terrifying.
How is this not just a blueprint for a totalitarian nightmare? Stalinism, fascism, or some sci-fi megacorporation dictating every aspect of our lives. What separates this divine order from a dictator's wet dream?
It is the absolute most critical question to ask, and it's the defining line between human tyranny and the systemic order proposed here. We have to look at the directional flow of resources and the legal constraints placed on the authority itself.
Okay, walk me through the directional flow.
In a totalitarian regime, whether it's a political dictatorship or a corporate oligarchy, the central authority absorbs the wealth and labor of the citizens to enrich a select few at the top. The flow of resources is purely upward, and it stays there.
The masses are left depleted while the state or the monopoly hoards the excess.
The classic pyramid scheme of human history.
Yeah.
Exactly. But in the universal sustenance engine, the return for surrendering to the central authority is rububiyat, universal nourishment.
Meaning the state has to give it back?
The central authority in this blueprint is legally barred from accumulation. It is not a reservoir. It is a distributional valve. Its sole constitutionally mandated function is to actively dismantle exploitative economic systems and guarantee the universal development of all citizens.
So the state can't build golden palaces for the leadership.
If the leadership builds a palace while a citizen is hungry, the system has already been fundamentally broken.
Wow.
If a citizen surrenders their excess wealth, the state deploys it instantaneously so that every child has access to top-tier education, every sick person has comprehensive care.
And every individual has the resources needed not just to survive biologically, but to develop their true human potential.
Exactly. It's a closed-loop system of mutual preservation.
Let's really game out the psychology of this because it's fascinating. Let's say I have the instinct to hoard millions of dollars. From a biological standpoint, I'm doing that because I'm terrified of the future.
Right, you're hoarding out of fear.
Yeah, I'm afraid of getting sick. I'm afraid my kids won't have homes. I'm afraid of scarcity. It's an animalistic desire for hypersecurity.
That's the bird with the twig again.
Exactly. But this system asks me to give up that illusion of individual financial dominance. In return, the entire collective machinery of the state guarantees that I, my children, and my neighbors will never face systemic deprivation.
You trade the anxiety of guarding your own fortress for the reality of collective structural invulnerability.
That is an incredible psychological trade-off, but it requires a tremendous amount of trust in the systemic enforcement.
It does. And the text highlights a highly specific, fascinating detail about how this sociopolitical structure views status and success in that context.
Oh, about the soldiers.
Yes, it uses the example of two systemic enforcers, soldiers, for lack of a better term, who respond to the call to defend the society.
Okay.
One returns victorious from the struggle, having dismantled an exploitative threat. The other falls on the battlefield and loses their biological life.
No, in almost every culture in human history, we treat those two outcomes very differently.
Very differently.
We build massive bronze statues for the victorious generals. We put them on currency. We give them political power. For the fallen, we have solemn ceremonies. We hand a folded flag to the grieving family, and we build a quiet memorial. There is a distinct hierarchy of success.
But in the logic of the central authority, as defined by this blueprint, both individuals hold exactly equal systemic rank.
Equal. But one won and one died.
Because the system does not evaluate them based on biological outcomes.
Mm-hmm.
Both individuals responded instantly to the call. Both fully subordinated their animal instinct for self-preservation to defend the permanent values of the society.
Oh, I see.
The physical outcome, whether their biology survived the encounter or not, is completely irrelevant to their human excellence. Their kuti, their true psychological and evolutionary self, is equally fortified and preserved.
They both made the ultimate human choice, therefore they are both eternally alive and hold the highest possible rank.
Precisely.
That is incredibly profound. It strips away all the ego and outcome bias from human action. It only cares about the purity of the commitment.
Exactly.
Okay, so we have the vocabulary and we have the economic engine of this equitable, mobilized society. But here is where we hit a massive, glaring contradiction with the real world.
The problem of evil and systemic injustice.
Yeah. If the socioeconomic engine of justice and equity is so perfect, and if universal laws favor this kind of collective empathy, why do corrupt, exploitative, hoarding societies often look so incredibly successful?
It's the million-dollar question.
We look around the globe today, or look back through history, and the systems that prioritize ruthless capital accumulation, the exploitation of the vulnerable, the monopolies, they always seem to have the biggest skyscrapers, the strongest militaries, the most advanced technology.
Right.
If the architecture of the universe favors justice, why do the bad guys always seem to be winning?
This brings us to what the notes describe as the social physics of the framework. And this requires us to understand a concept called the social physics of requital, or Mukafat-e-Amal.
Mukafat-e-Amal. Okay.
This is arguably the most crucial philosophical pillar in Parwez's entire synthesis because it answers the problem of systemic injustice without relying on mysticism.
How does it do that?
Traditionally, when bad things happen to bad people, religion frames it as an angry deity throwing lightning bolts from the sky.
Right, divine retribution.
And when bad people succeed, it's framed as a mysterious test or the unknowable will of God. But the rationalist view we are studying entirely discards that anthropomorphic image.
It replaces the angry man in the sky with a cold scientific matrix.
Exactly. It treats morality as a form of physics.
Like cause and effect?
Inevitable cause and effect. Actions naturally and unavoidably yield outcomes. There's no escape clause, no amount of money you can pay to bypass the physics.
Okay, so good actions lead to good outcomes.
Acts that defend justice and humanity, which the text calls amal-i-hazana, naturally fortify the true self and strengthen the structural integrity of a society.
And the bad actions?
Conversely, self-serving, exploitative, hoarding actions, fujur, gradually scientifically disintegrate the core human personality and the social fabric. It is as unalterable as the law of gravity.
Okay, I understand the theory, but I have to push back on the gravity analogy.
Why is that?
If I hold an apple at the window and let go, it falls immediately. Gravity doesn't take a 10-year break. But in economics and politics, there is a massive time delay.
Ah, I see what you mean.
Right. If a massive corporation ruthlessly exploits 1 million workers and destroys a local ecosystem, its stock price doesn't plummet the next day. It goes up. The CEO gets a massive bonus. Where is the gravity there? It looks like they broke the laws of physics and got away with it.
And that perfectly valid frustration brings us to two incredibly nuanced terms from the text that explain the time delay: imla and itham.
Imla and itham, what do those mean?
Imla translates to respite, or, more accurately, a gestation period. Itham translates to burden, or structural decay.
Gestation and burden.
The traditional religious view often interprets the temporary success of wicked people as God arbitrarily delaying their punishment to see if they will repent. But the rationalist view explains it as a natural scientific gestation period inherent in the physics of society.
Like an agricultural cycle.
Exactly. When you plant a poisonous seed, a toxic tree doesn't spring out of the ground overnight. It requires a specific gestation period to take root, grow, and manifest its final destructive form.
Let's bring this into the modern era because I was trying to wrap my head around this time delay and I thought of a slightly more visceral analogy.
Oh, I'd love to hear it.
A really terrible diet.
Okay, a terrible diet.
Imagine a person who decides they're going to eat nothing but ultra-processed, deep-fried fast food every single day. On day one, they don't drop dead of a heart attack.
Right, they probably feel fine.
In fact, they feel phenomenal. The food is literally engineered in a lab to hit every pleasure center in the brain. They feel full, they get a massive dopamine rush, and they have plenty of energy.
They look at someone eating a salad and think, I'm having way more fun than you and I feel great.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That apparent success, that period of feeling full, happy, and seemingly invincible, that is the IMLA, the gestation period.
That is a flawless modern application.
Yeah.
It is the evolutionary illusion of prosperity.
Right. But beneath the surface, silently, every single day, the cholesterol is building up in their arteries. The plaque is hardening.
The structural integrity of their cardiovascular system is degrading at a microscopic level.
Yes. And that silent accumulating damage is the ITHM, the structural burden. They aren't getting away with anything. The laws of human biology are actively at work, demanding a consequence.
And the longer the IMLA lasts, the heavier and more dense the item becomes.
Until the inevitable terminal collapse, a massive, fatal heart attack.
Let's scale your analogy up to the macroeconomic level, because this is where the text's geopolitical critique is sharpest. Let's look at historical empires, or even modern financial crises. Think about the 2008 subprime mortgage crisis.
Oh, that's a perfect example of IMLA and ITHM.
Exactly. For years, financial institutions were generating astronomical, unprecedented wealth by bundling toxic, high-risk debt and selling it as AAA-rated secure investments.
The champagne was flowing, bonuses were in the tens of millions, and the architecture of that financial system looked completely invincible.
To the outside observer, it looked like they had conquered the laws of economics. That was their IMLA. It was a dopamine rush of false prosperity.
But every single toxic mortgage they underwrote was adding a microscopic layer of cholesterol to the global economy.
Precisely. The ITHM, the burden, was growing exponentially beneath the floorboards. The financial elite weren't experiencing divine favor. They were experiencing a necessary gestation period before a catastrophic structural failure.
And when the collapse finally happened, it wasn't an angry god striking Wall Street with lightning.
No, it was simply the accumulated weight of their own exploitative actions breaking the foundation. The text calls this inevitable terminal collapse, azad-i-muhin, a humiliating systemic disintegration.
So, applying this blueprint to how we view the world, when we see a massive exploitative empire or a ruthless corporate monopoly or a dictator seemingly thriving, accumulating billions of dollars and crushing their competition.
We aren't looking at a permanent victory.
Right. We shouldn't be intimidated by it. We are simply observing a system in its IMLA phase. We are just watching the cholesterol build up in the arteries of their empire.
That is the analytical lens the text demands. Because these exploitative systems measure their success by biological and material markers, quarterly profits, GDP, the size of their military face, they are completely structurally blind to the rot in their own foundation.
They mistake their growing tumor for a muscle.
I love that phrasing. Mistaking a tumor for a muscle.
It's a heavy, paradigm-shifting way to view reality.
It really is.
Well, we've established the vocabulary, we've defined the economic engine of universal sustenance, and we've mapped out the cold, hard social physics of requital.
The theory is set.
Right. Now let's see how the source material applies these exact tools to decode the specific verses. This is where we transition from the theory of the blueprint to reading the actual schematic lines.
Getting into the granular extraction of Surah Al-Imran.
Yes, starting around verse 169. Now, the traditional translation of this section usually says something along the lines of, "Do not consider those killed in the way of God as dead. They are alive with their Lord, receiving provision."
We touched on this earlier, but it's crucial to see it in context.
Right. How does the rationalist synthesis fully decode this specific text?
It strips away the mystical afterlife imagery entirely and applies the exact definitions of Hayat and Amwat we discussed. Do not consider them dead is not a comforting metaphor for grieving families.
It's literal.
It is a literal, scientific reassessment of what constitutes human life. These individuals sacrifice their biological pulse to defend permanent values and protect the collective.
Therefore, they have not suffered a true evolutionary death.
Exactly. They have achieved a high and elevated, indestructible evolutionary life.
And what about the provision they receive? Because the text uses the word yirsakun.
Look back at our legend. Rizq is not heavenly fruit, rivers of honey, or mansions in the clouds. It is the continuous sustenance of psychological and systemic growth.
Okay, so what does that look like for them?
Having completely transcended the animalistic fear of physical death, they achieve a state of absolute psychological invulnerability. They cannot be threatened.
Wow. And the subsequent verses state that they rejoice in this bounty.
But they aren't rejoicing in a private, selfish salvation. They aren't sitting on a cloud playing a harp, looking down at the world burning and gloating that they made it to the VIP section.
Right. It's not an exclusive country club in the sky.
Far from it. They rejoice in the tangible, material realization that their physical sacrifice successfully protected the universal values of the society. Their structural integrity holds fast.
And crucially, the text emphasizes that they extend this joyous solidarity to those who are still left behind.
The ones still actively engaged in the socio-political struggle, yes.
They recognize that their actions fortified the central authority, and they find their eternal satisfaction in the ongoing success of the collective system. Because of this, they are completely free from fear or grief.
Which brings up a very practical problem.
Yeah. We've established that those who defend the system achieve psychological invulnerability. But let's look at the real world. The forces opposing them, the hoarders, the monopolies, the corrupt institutions, they aren't just going to quietly hand over their power.
Of course not. They have massive PR machines, endless capital, and they use fear as a primary weapon.
How does the text suggest the defenders handle that kind of psychological warfare?
This brings us to the text introduction of the concept of shaitan, commonly translated as Satan. And again, the redefinition here is incredibly practical. This is one of the most rounded, real-world applications in the entire lecture.
Okay, because traditionally, Shaitan is personified as a literal, supernatural demon with horns, whispering evil temptations into the hearts of men in the dark, trying to get them to commit personal sins.
Right. But functionally and rationally, within the context of systemic socioeconomics, Shaitan represents subversive, exploitative socio-political forces. It represents the propagandists.
The propagandists.
It is the institutional voice of capitalistic hegemony and tyranny.
Let's make this concrete. How do these subversive forces actually operate in a society?
They operate through highly coordinated psychological warfare. The whispering campaigns mentioned in the text aren't supernatural voices. They are orchestrated media narratives, economic threats, sanctions, and political intimidation.
Oh, wow.
The verse explicitly describes a scenario where the defenders have suffered a setback and the exploitative forces launch a propaganda campaign. They say, "The masses have gathered against you, so fear them."
The masses have gathered against you, so fear them. It's the ultimate playground bullying tactic scaled up to geopolitics. We have the money, we have the weapons, we control the narrative. Conform or be crushed.
Exactly. They exaggerate their economic and military superiority to paralyze the systemic enforcers with terror. They want you to look at their massive armies, their endless bank accounts, and their total control of the media, and conclude that resistance is biologically suicidal.
They are actively trying to trigger your animal instinct for self-preservation so that you abandon your human values and surrender.
But the source notes point out a fascinating, almost paradoxical reaction that happens in the minds of people who have integrated into the universal sustenance engine when they are targeted by this propaganda.
Yes, and this is where the psychological invulnerability truly manifests. Because when exploitative forces attempt to instill terror by aggressively exaggerating their might, it actually causes the resolve of the defenders to organically intensify.
Instead of breaking under the pressure, they harden into diamond.
Why does that happen? Structurally, how does that work in their psychology? If someone points a much bigger gun at you, the natural reaction is fear. Why do they get stronger?
Because their reliance is entirely on the constitutional laws of the divine order, the social physics we discussed. The text uses a specific phrase, hasbunallah.
Meaning the law of the system is sufficient for us.
Exactly. They know that adherence to universal principles, justice, equity, courage, renders them strategically and psychologically invulnerable. They deeply understand the law of requital.
So they see through the illusion.
They know that the enemy's massive wealth and bloated military isn't a sign of strength. It is just a massive accumulation of itham, a fatal structural burden that is guaranteed to collapse.
So the louder the exploitative forces scream, the more aggressively they boast about their wealth, the more it confirms to the defenders that the system of tyranny is fundamentally insecure and entering its terminal phase.
It's like watching an opponent in a debate start yelling and banging on the table. It doesn't scare you. It just proves they've lost the argument.
The text is a brilliant line concluding this section. It states that it is only Shaitan who frightens his allies.
That is a vital diagnostic tool for any society.
Think about the implications of that. The propagation of fear, paranoia, and defeatism is strictly the tactic of the exploiters.
If a media ecosystem or a political leader relies on making you terrified of your neighbors, terrified of losing your money, terrified of the future, they are acting as the propagandist.
If you are a citizen of the divine order, your only fear should be the violation of the constitutional principles that guarantee your collective survival. You shouldn't fear losing your bank account. You should fear losing your structural integrity.
Which brings us to the final verses of this extraction, addressing the opportunists.
Ah, yes.
Because in any conflict, there are always those who look at the terrifying, exaggerated might of the exploitative forces and decide to switch sides. They calculate the biological odds and sell out.
The text addresses this by saying, do not be grieved by those who hasten to kufr. Now, kufr usually translates to disbelief, right? Like denying the existence of God.
Yes, but in this systemic economic context, kufr is the subversive rush of opportunists to trade their socio-political conviction for exploitative material gain.
It is systemic defection.
It is selling out the central authority for a piece of the oppressor's wealth. The verses tell the defenders not to mourn these defectors or fear that their betrayal will somehow damage or destroy the system.
Because they can't actually damage the physics of the universe.
Exactly. The system operates on unalterable scientific laws. By hastening into opportunism, these defectors aren't harming the truth. They are merely destroying their own psychological and systemic integrity.
To go back to an earlier analogy, they're eagerly buying a first-class ticket on a sinking ship.
They're purchasing their own agonizing ruin. And the extraction concludes by putting the final nail in the coffin of the oppressor's illusion. Let not the disbelievers think the respite we give them is good.
There it is, the imla, the gestation period.
The apparent prosperity of the exploitative powers is an evolutionary illusion. It's a natural gestation period dictated by the social physics of requital, granting them time only to accumulate heavier, more fatal structural burdens.
This unchecked hoarding guarantees their humiliating psychological and systemic disintegration.
The text leaves absolutely no room for doubt. The physics of social justice are absolute, and gravity always wins.
It's an incredibly tight, rigorously logical framework. It's like watching a master mathematician solve a massive, complex equation where all the variables balance out perfectly.
It is very elegant.
But again, to return to our opening analogy, a blueprint is totally useless if you just frame it on the wall and admire the math.
You have to build it.
How does this philosophy demand to be implemented in the real world? Because the source material doesn't just leave this as abstract theology to be debated in a university. It outlines specific, actionable items for state policy, education, and ethics.
The implementation phase is where the truly radical nature of this text shines, because it demands an upheaval of our current civic structures.
Okay, where do we start?
The first major policy directive derived from this blueprint is the deliberate eradication of psychological warfare. If subversive forces operate through fear-mongering and exaggerating their economic supremacy, the state has a fundamental constitutional duty to protect its citizens from this propaganda.
But how do you actually do that? You can't just pass a law banning fear, and censorship usually backfires.
You don't ban it. You inoculate the population against it through education. The text argues that the state must develop comprehensive educational and informational frameworks to train the populace.
And then how?
Citizens must be taught the social physics of requital from childhood. They must learn to view the financial and numerical supremacy of adversaries not with terror, but with analytical clarity.
So education must shift from merely teaching rote facts and biological survival skills, like how to pass a standardized test to get a corporate job, to actively fortifying the kuti, the true self.
Exactly. When a citizen sees a massive capitalist monopoly threatening their livelihood, their educated response shouldn't be panic. Their response should be an analytical understanding that the monopoly is currently accumulating its structural burden, its ism, and is therefore structurally vulnerable.
That requires a total foundational rewiring of how a culture values success, which brings us to the second massive action item, redefining civic virtue and national sacrifice.
This one is huge.
I was thinking about this earlier when we discussed the kaidin, the people who just sit back. In our modern capitalist societies, how do we distribute societal honors? We give medals, tax breaks, and immense societal respect to passive philanthropy.
We celebrate the crumbs.
Right. Take the billionaire who spends 50 years hoarding wealth, exploiting thousands of workers, destroying local economies, and leveraging monopolies. Then, in his 70s, he takes 1% of that hoarded fortune and donates it to put his name on a new wing of an art museum.
We throw massive black-tie galas for that person. We put them on magazine covers. We call them virtuous.
Looking at this blueprint, what does Parwez's synthesis say about that entire ecosystem of honor?
It demands an absolute, immediate dismantling of that reward system. The state and the cultural narratives must explicitly separate private charity from collective systemic order.
Wow.
National honors, structural incentives, and societal respect must be forcefully redirected away from passive asceticism and philanthropy funded by exploitation. You cannot buy your way into virtue using the currency of oppression.
So there are absolutely no medals for sweeping the mosque or funding a hospital wing with exploited money.
None. Honors must be awarded exclusively to the systemic enforcers, those who actively engage in structural reform, those who physically defend marginalized groups, and those who enforce the rule of equitable law at significant personal or economic cost.
Furthermore, the cultural concept of martyrdom must be broadened and heavily institutionalized.
Yes, it must encompass anyone who willfully risks their biological life, their wealth, or their societal comfort to uphold universal justice.
The investigative journalist exposing a corrupt monopoly, the whistleblower risking their freedom, the activist standing in front of the bulldozer, these are the individuals the society must revere.
The third action item is perhaps the most disruptive to our current global order, and it ties directly back to our debate about the central authority.
Institutionalizing the law of requital in macroeconomics.
Exactly. The text argues that socioeconomic rubaiyat universal nourishment must legally take absolute precedence over capital accumulation.
This is the economic engine codified into law. The state must legally recognize that the unrestrained accumulation of wealth and power by a few individuals or corporations is not a sign of a healthy, booming economy.
It is a systemic threat. It is a burden, an ism, that weakens the entire national fabric and leads to inevitable collapse.
It's the cholesterol in the arteries, and the state has to act as the cardiologist.
Precisely. Legislative policies must be deeply rooted in this social physics. Economic structures, tax codes, and property laws must be aggressively designed to actively prevent monopolies from utilizing their financial respite to exploit the masses.
So material wealth's critical infrastructure and physiological resources must be legally categorized as collective tools for the universal development of humanity.
They cannot be treated as ends in themselves, and they certainly cannot be treated as a biological luxury for a select few. They are the blood that must circulate to keep the collective body alive.
If the blood pools in one area, say, it all rushes to the head or into the offshore bank accounts of a few billionaires, the rest of the body undergoes necrosis. The limbs die.
The central authority's only job is to ensure aggressive, continuous circulation.
That is the pure essence of Nizam-e-Rubaiyat. The state evaluates its success not by measuring how high the ceiling of wealth can reach for a few elites, but by ensuring there is an unbreakable, high-quality floor of development, dignity, and sustenance for every single citizen.
That's the blueprint in action.
This has been an incredibly dense, genuinely paradigm-shifting journey. Let's briefly recap how far we've come today, because we've covered a massive amount of ground.
They really have.
We started by taking the blueprint out of the museum frame. We fundamentally redefined the very vocabulary of the text, moving away from a private, isolated religion of mazhab and embracing the comprehensive public socioeconomic system of deen.
We learned that true piety isn't passive patience or reciting words. It's the active, kinetic confrontation of systemic exploitation.
We fundamentally redefined what it means to be alive and dead, realizing that merely surviving, accumulating wealth, and protecting your own biology without upholding human values is just an animalistic, walking death.
We then explored the mechanics of the universal sustenance engine, where individuals subordinate their hoarding instincts to a central authority. Not to create a totalitarian nightmare, but to guarantee a distributional system that dismantles monopolies and ensures no citizen is left behind.
We mapped the cold, unyielding social physics of requital, understanding that the apparent, glittering success of exploitative powers is merely a temporary gestation period, an illusion of prosperity, before their accumulated structural burden causes a terminal collapse.
And finally, we decoded how this theory applies to actual statecraft. structurally educating the populace against psychological warfare, entirely redefining who society honors as virtuous, and legally enforcing the continuous circulation of economic resources.
It is a breathtakingly cohesive system. It challenges almost everything about how the modern world operates. But if we try to synthesize all of this deep theory, all these redefinitions into one overarching permanent value, one ultimate takeaway from Parwez's rationalist synthesis today, what is the core truth of this blueprint?
The absolute sovereignty of human excellence over biological survival.
The sovereignty of human excellence.
It is the realization that the evolutionary immortality of the true human self, the Kuti, is the only currency that actually matters in the cosmos. Physical life, your biological pulse, your bank account, these are merely the oyster shell meant to cultivate the pearl of human character.
If you protect the pearl, if you defend justice and equity, you live eternally within the system. But if you crush the pearl just to save the shell, you have already died.
Exactly.
Which leaves us with a massive next step question, a bridge to the next deep dive in this series.
Uh-oh, the big question.
If the ultimate goal of human evolution is to integrate into this collective system, to trust the social physics, and to surrender your wealth and life to the central authority to ensure universal justice, what happens when the central authority itself becomes corrupted?
Because human history tells us that institutions fail.
Right. How does this rationalist framework correct a failing system from within? If the central authority, the markaz, becomes the very subversive force spreading fear and hoarding wealth, what is the constitutional mechanism for the citizens to reclaim the blueprint? That is a profound tension we will have to explore next time.
It is the ultimate stress test of any civilizational blueprint.
It really is. And as we wrap up, I want to leave you, the listener, with a specific scenario to ponder as you go about your week.
Something to chew on.
Yeah, I want you to look around and think about the most successful, wealthy, seemingly untouchable corporation, institution, or political figure in your life today. The one that seems to constantly bend the rules, exploit the vulnerable, damage the environment, and yet only ever sees its stock price and power rise.
The ones who seem to defy the physics.
Exactly. When you look at those towering glass headquarters or those massive profit margins, are you really looking at a permanent, gravity-defying success?
Or are you simply witnessing a gestation period?
Are you just watching the cholesterol build up, waiting for the structural weight of their own exploitation to cause an inevitable terminal collapse?
It changes how you view power entirely. You stop being afraid of it.
It really does. So the next time you look at the architectural blueprint of our society, don't just read the text in the margins and hope for good luck. Look at the structures, look at the people around you, and ask yourself, based on this standard, who is actually alive and who is merely breathing?